I think one important thing, is socially, nobody likes to talk about things not going well. We generally, when you go out drinking, you don't tell somebody about all the things that are going wrong in life. You're always talking about all the awesome things you're doing. And I think we are trained as human beings to think or try to appear positive and sort of almost train ourselves and our brains to say that things are going well.
This is Siddharth Aluwalia. Welcome to the 100x Entrepreneur Podcast. This episode is brought to you by Prime Venture Partners, an early stage VC fund led by Amit Somani, Shripati Acharya, and Sanjay Swamy. Prime is often the first institutional investor in category creating tech startups in fintech, SaaS, healthcare, and education, such as Mygate, Neo, and Reco. To know more about Prime, visit primevp.in. Today, I have with me Sanjay Swamy, Managing Partner, Prime Venture Partners, and T.N. Hari, Chief People Officer, BigBasket. Hari and Sanjay have penned together a new book, Sailing Through a Storm, Making a Crisis Work for You. The book is on how crisis shapes organizations, individuals, and countries, and what are the best mechanisms to cope with it, to emerge out of them. It's a journey which Hari and Sanjay will take you through on what they have faced personally, professionally, and what they have observed in their environment on managing some of the worst crises people face in their lives. We are sitting in December 2020, almost a year in the worst pandemic people living in this age have ever seen. Some of you who are listening would have lost someone, a friend, or a family member, would have themselves gone through COVID. Some of you would have lost a job, and some of you would have been through mental and emotional hell. But there is something which we can use this experience to emerge a better version out of ourselves through this crisis and to emerge as a grown individual. Welcome, Sanjay and Hari, to the podcast.
Thank you, Siddharth.
Thanks for that. Great to be here.
So, Sanjay and Hari, would love to start with the story of your friendship and what gave birth to the book.
So I think Sanjay and I have been friends at school, and in school you always have a best friend, and Sanjay happened to be my best friend in primary school. So we were there from first grade to the fifth grade, after which Sanjay left for Bangalore. We grew up in a small town during those years in Orissa, a very, nondescript township where a public sector undertaking was located. Sanjay moved to Bangalore after our fifth grade, and I continued to remain there. And we met after we turned 50, and we continued to remain friends. And at some point of time, we decided, why not do something together? And as we talked about, what was happening during the pandemic, life turned upside down in many ways for all of us. And this was the first time that, many of us were seeing a crisis of this magnitude. And these kinds of crises, one doesn't see more than once in a lifetime. So I think we spotted this early, and we realized that there is a mega trend, taking shape, and lives are being turned upside down. People are adopting or adapting to new normals, new ways of life. So we thought, why don't we write a book? And then we thought what the theme should be. Then we realized that, while the pandemic has created a crisis for all of us, we have also dealt with different types of crisis all our lives, both as individuals and parts of organizations, and being part of organizations and institutions. So a crisis is not particularly new. In fact, some of the crises that we have dealt with are far worse than the pandemic. For instance, a family that's lost a loved one, the crisis that they deal with is far worse than a pandemic. So there's nothing particularly new to a crisis. But then we realized, what, this is the right time to put together a book that talks about a crisis in general. It could be a crisis in your personal life. It could be a crisis in your organizational life. It could be just about a crisis on being born into adversity, and still how do you make the best of it. So I think we identified a crisis and dealing with it as a story that was worth telling.
So, Sanjay, why is this book important to you?
Yeah, so just to add a little bit to what Hari said, and to get to your question as well. Yeah, Hari and I think we have very fond memories of literally the ages 5 to 10, right? Most people may not remember a whole lot, especially once you get to our age. But we had a very, very close bond at that time, and while we never stayed in touch, we I think when we reunited about 6-7 years ago, I don't think there was. It felt like we'd been together all along, right? And so when he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm writing this book. Would you like to co-author it with me?" It kind of was symbolic because I think during these crises and these moments, we turn to our best friends, right, for several things, right? And I thought, wow, it's a great opportunity to be writing something with someone who's for a long time been, my closest friend, and and in fact, the dedication of this book that I've done at least is to best friends, and Hari's done to, I guess, his best friend, his daughter. But I think unlike most crises that several of us would have experienced, and I can personally say I've been through probably 4 in my adult life, right, 4 to 5. This one is unusual in that everybody has been impacted by it, right? So this is not one where somebody went through something and others cannot empathize with it, right? Everybody actually has, as you said, in some cases under very tragic circumstances, lost somebody close or gone through a pretty narrow escape, either to close or themselves. But certainly people can empathize with it. But I think history is strewn with situations where actually crises happen on a daily basis to people, right? And finding the strength to come out of it is the biggest challenge, right? And whether you look at it from an entrepreneur's perspective, where companies go through near-death experiences or personal experiences like Hari talked about as well, these situations will constantly arise, and people have to. There is actually, as we believe in this book, through examples, there is a structured formula almost for how to deal with these situations, right? And we thought we'll bring it out through a combination of examples as well as some abstracted lessons at the end of the book. So that's sort of the background behind the book, and some of these are actually very personal examples that some of us have faced, which we have shared, and others with people close to us. I think one important thing, is socially, nobody likes to talk about things not going well. We generally, when you go out drinking, you don't tell somebody about all the things that are going wrong in life. You're always talking about all the awesome things you're doing. And I think we are trained as human beings to think or try to appear positive and sort of almost train ourselves and our brains to say that things are going well. So we thought this is an opportunity here for us to share, because people from the outside may not realize what people have gone through, right? And in some ways that will give strength to people when they read this and say, okay, that's not so. I mean, what I'm going through now isn't half as bad as what people have been through, and hopefully that gives people confidence.
So, Hari and Sanjay, if you can share what was the biggest crisis in each one of your lives?
Siddharth, I think every day is a crisis. Every day is a great day. Every day is a challenge. Every day is an opportunity, right? And I think at any point in time, every crisis looks like or every challenge looks like it's a crisis, right? I would argue that preparing for JEE or preparing for second PUC exams or my engineering exams later on that given day, it looked like the biggest crisis you're going to face, right? But certainly there are times, I think, where it's a combination of health, whether it's personal health or someone near to you, or financial health, right? I think those are the 2 times where people feel most vulnerable and challenged about. And I've talked about the book several times where I've been through a combination of both, and I know people that have been through a combination of both. So situations where you're living in a foreign land, you're down to a few $100s in the bank, you don't have a job, you don't know where the next paycheck is going to come from, right? But you keep plugging away, you keep doing the right thing, and you keep. So I would say that would be one example, right, in my life. But there have been several others as well. And I don't think that I did anything different before or after them, right? And I think you can only focus on what you can do in life, right? As they say, input metrics, for example, right? That's literally all the things you can do. And I think in general, people tend to think very inwards and clam up a little bit, right? And crises are moments where you actually need to talk to people. It gives you confidence, and you actually can work through a solution, right? In my case, I would say the first time, I was completely out of money and without a job, married in a foreign country, and my wife was my greatest support. We were newly married at the time, right? And talking to each other, we came up with some creative solutions, and we realized, look, it's not the end of the world, right? The worst that can happen was acceptable to us at that time, right? And then good things ended up happening after a period of time. But yeah, I think everybody goes through things, and dealing with it is what defines your character.
What about you, Hari?
Siddharth, I don't know if I have faced a personal crisis like the way Sanjay has faced. Some of the organizations I worked for, went through some of these near death moments and some serious crises. I will talk about one of them. But if I have to talk about a real personal crisis, I think it's about my mother's mental health. So that has been the biggest one by far, and I have not talked about it a lot. Maybe this will be the first podcast when I will be talking about it. The book I've mentioned about it. I've also realized that it's important, to be vulnerable. Being vulnerable is gives you some strength. I think this is something you discover a little late in life. So if I can share this with younger people, I think it'll be helpful if people can be vulnerable right from the early stages. It's not such a bad thing after all. As Sanjay said, what we're all keen to put on a mask and show our best side, but it's also okay, to show some of these warts. It's perfectly all right. Actually, it makes you look like a real person. So, when my mother was not particularly healthy in terms of mental health. And, if I look back, I think she suffered from bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And I never knew what these terms were at that point of time. In fact, in the town that I lived in, the society that I grew up in, mental health was not considered the way it's considered now. It was considered, a black spot, something that should be despised, something, that shouldn't be talked about. So that was something that I had to deal with. It began unfolding at some point of time. It grew very rapidly, especially when I went to the ninth grade. After that, things began going from bad to worse. And she was there with us till almost till 2016. And life was tragic. For the last 15 years, she never left one room in the house that she was in the village. She never left that place, and she never left a single room where she stayed. So I feel guilty also. In school, I was always trying to get out of the house. For me, school was a big distraction. And it's not that I only had negative things. School was a great place, actually. It was a lovely place. I had great friends. Our teachers were good. The culture in the school was good. The culture in the township was good. So everything was all well, I would say. But home was not necessarily a great place. So I took a lot of, the other things, interests in life, education, sports meant a lot to me because they were a source of joy, satisfaction, and also distraction. I was also in some ways wanting to get out of my home and find a place for myself in this world. And in some ways, running away from home. At some points, if I look back, was that good or bad? I don't know. Was that escapism? I don't know. But that was the way it was. And I think I'm living with it. I think have come to terms with it now. Slowly, I've been able to come to terms with it. But that phase of my life, the challenges that I went through at some of those moments are something which is, I would say, extremely difficult to forget. And I think it's very difficult for a child to deal with those challenges. And I had no sibling with whom I could talk to. Typically, if you have an elder sibling, you could talk to someone. I had nobody to talk to. And it's not something that you can talk to your friends about it. So I think clamming all the thoughts in that little head wasn't easy. So from my perspective, I think clearly there is no other adversity that I have faced in life that compares with this. This perhaps is the only real personal adversity I've faced. But I think organizations that I worked for went through existential crisis. I'll just talk about one, which is Virtusa. So this was a US-based company, located in Boston, the headquarters at Boston. And I, as the chief people officer, was based out of Hyderabad, which was our epicenter in terms of headcount. We had most of the people operating out of Asia. The delivery centers were in Asia, and we listed the company on Nasdaq in 2007, sometime in August 2007, and that was when the rumblings of the credit crisis actually began. A little after that. And we took great pride, all of us in the management team being part of a company listed on Nasdaq. It's a dream come true. Ticker symbol VRTU. So proud doing the road shows and finally listing at $14. But very quickly we also realized, that this credit crisis was taking shape. And suddenly Bear Stearns collapsed. Bear Stearns was actually the lead banker for us that helped us take public along with JP Morgan. And ironically, JP Morgan ended up acquiring Bear Stearns. And this began to have an impact on Virtusa as well. A lot of clients began canceling orders, canceling contracts, especially those which were involved discretionary spend. And a big number of clients were doing discretionary kind of work with us. Projects were discretionary, and revenues began coming off. Share prices came down dramatically. All stock options underwater. We had to right size, and when you right size, you end up identifying who goes, right. So then we looked at what approach should we take, and the approach that we took was identify those who were highly compensated, who cost the company very significantly, and whose contributions at this point of time were questionable in terms of having an immediate impact. People cost was the most significant cost, so there was no opportunity to look at any other cost. So it really was about slashing people costs. And since those in the US and Europe cost more than those who were employed in India, we had to do a lot of cost cutting in those geographies. And obviously a lot of people, it was an American company, and imagine a head of HR from Asia visiting an American company's headquarters and telling them that we need to lay off people here. It was not easy for me. I was doing something like this for the first time, and therefore the very thought of it was a bit scary. So in fact, people had told me that before you go out and speak in this town hall, there are some individuals who are going to ask you difficult questions. There are some people who will intend to be very difficult. I was even told their names. So Chris Kanakaratne, who was the CEO, left me by myself, and and that was a good thing, because he didn't want his presence there, because he thought it will in some ways constrain the way I express myself. And but it was also a bit lonely doing that. And actually it went off quite okay. And the biggest problem for me personally was that I had to lay off about 3 or 4 people from the HR team. And the individual that I respected the most was the HR head for North Americas. I was instrumental in hiring him. He was one person I had deep, deep respect for. He was clearly, even to this date, one of the best HR professionals I have ever seen. But sometimes you need to take these decisions without emotions, as we said in the chapter. Balancing reason and emotion. You need to be able to do that well. And we took that call. I had to tell Clark that we are, taking this call, and seemed okay with it. Thinking back, reflecting, I wish if I could do this again, I would have done it better. And there were some missteps that I did. In fact, we were wondering whether he should communicate, further headcount reductions to his team, or should I be part of that? And we took the call that he would do it. May not have been the best of things to have happened. And finally life over a period of time began bouncing back. At the end of it, in a public company where public investors are looking at whether the management has the guts to take the right calls, I think that really matters a lot. And I think we were seen as taking some of these right calls, some of these bold steps, correcting our costs and aligning them with revenue which had come off very significantly. And therefore, profitability began slowly, coming back, and things slowly began returning to normal. But it was a long time. It took almost a year for things to come back to normal.
Sanjay?
So, I'll rather than dive into an event particularly. As I've written in the book, personally, I've experienced in my adult professional life about 3 or 4 instances, right? So there was the first time in '92, I had just gotten married, living in the US, out of money, foreign student, trying to find a job during the recession years. So this is right after the first Gulf War, right? In fact, as I mentioned in the book, there was people would talk about, Liz Taylor's passion, Calvin Klein's obsession, and George Bush's recession as the three fragrances that were going around, right? And later on, I've seen 9/11, again, working in the Valley, the world changed that day, right, permanently. Then in 2008, the one that Hari was talking about, same instance, I was CEO of MCheck. I was raising funding at that time, and everything changed after that, right? Sequoia put out a thing, and most entrepreneurs, from that generation will remember the story around those times, right? I think what's interesting here in all of these cases, right? The first thing that you have to realize is the world has changed, and it's changed permanently, right? And you go through these crises. The worst thing you can do is not accept that the crisis has happened, right? And the moment you've accepted it, actually, it's very liberating for people. That now you're no longer worried about trying to preserve the past. You're saying, what am I going to do from here, right? And in a strange way, while it is a very tragic year this year for many, you don't even have to explain to anybody. Everybody understands, right? Whereas in those situations, right, like when I was going through fundraising and the world changed, and suddenly the value of your company was dramatically different, few people are outside of your ecosystem could understand what you were talking about, right? So whereas here today, actually, we have a situation where everybody understands. But I think accepting it is a very difficult thing for people to do, and we keep living in the past rather than in the reality, right? Once you do that, and I've talked about some specifics that I experienced in the book, right, during each of these, it's actually very liberating. The other thing I talked about was a very interesting story. I met an elderly gentleman, or I considered him elderly at the time. Now his then age is probably less than my current age, but at the time, I was around 25, and the Gulf War was going on, and the US and Iraq were sort of taking opposing positions. And I was just saying, we must make sure that we don't fire the first bullet, right? And we being the Americans. And he said, "You're so wrong, young man. What's most important is that we do fire the last bullet, because then we can tell the story as we wanted it to be told, right?" And so a lot of times people also hide, right? And they come back, and then people start talking about what might have been, right? Or the people's versions, right? So people also need to be very proactive about communication here, right? Whether it's internally, as Hari did in the organization there, or externally, right? Because controlling the narrative becomes a very important thing as well, right? How you communicate it and explain it to people. So accepting the problem, looking for solutions in it, and being open about communication, right, and honest about communication is very, very important, because otherwise people will conveniently, especially in business, twist things where they gives their company the upper hand over you in the competitive situation.
Hari and Sanjay, why don't you share also some of the stories from the book, you know, of crisis and the lessons learned?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first with one
Yeah.
example, and then Hari might add a couple more, right? Yeah, so as I was saying, right, during maybe I'll talk about the story that most people in India might be at least relatively familiar with. So I was one of the first mobile payments entrepreneurs here in India, right? And was CEO of a startup called MCheck in 2006 to 2010, which in many ways was sort of the precursor to a lot of what's happening today with mobile payments in a different sort of incarnation and approach. It was on the SIM card, a very challenging attempt at trying to do mobile payments in many ways. With smartphones now, things have gotten a lot simpler and easier, right? And it was sort of the early days of entrepreneurship in India. Very few people really knew what a startup was, so hiring people into this ecosystem, and certainly a tech startup in Bangalore, in India at that time, it was still the first wave of technology companies in India were really IT services providers, and we have some giants here in India, right? So it was sort of a very interesting time where we were trying to create a branded service in partnership with telcos and banks and Visa and what have you in an early era, pre Aadhaar, pre everything, right? And that was some of the lessons learned from that sort of forced me to later on volunteer with the Aadhaar program. And we were going through fundraising, right? And most startups, today, fundraising is almost seen as a right by many entrepreneurs. But it's actually, quite a significant risk that an investor is taking, which nowadays, of being on the investor side, I understand that a lot more, right? And, we were in the midst of a funding round and a lot of details going on, working through the mechanics, and suddenly, September '08 happened, right? And the public markets in the US collapsed. Everything changed. Financial markets collapsed, and Sequoia put out a thing saying, end of the good times, right? And we weren't even talking to Sequoia; it was other VCs that we were talking to, right? But it had a domino effect on everybody, right? And here I was looking at my thing saying, why is it affecting me? It has not changed my opportunity. It has not changed my company. It has not changed anything, right? But the reality is everything had changed, right? And it took a lot of hardship to try to figure out, how are you going to deal with this situation? I can't say I dealt with it really well at the time. We did the best we could at the time, but it kind of had eventually a fatal impact on the company, right? Not just that one incident, but generally the overall trajectory from that point on, changed completely, right? And for me as an entrepreneur, it was devastating, right? I would say that there were times where it really shattered my dreams, right? And was the hardest thing to deal with, right? And eventually at some point I said, look, this is just not going to be a big company, and I need to move on in life, right? When that aha moment actually happened, it was the moment it struck me later on that I was done. I was at the airport, in fact, planning to leave and go meet a client. You pulled out my BlackBerry and emailed my board and said, today's my last day, right? And I'll be most cooperative, right? And that's something for an entrepreneur, right? If your heart is no longer in it, if you no longer think you can build the biggest company on the planet, probably the best thing I did was leave at then and there, right? And because I would have done the company a disservice if I had continued to hang on in there and hope something would change, right? That doesn't mean one should give up. It had been 4 long years of toil, but it was a hard thing to do, and I did that, and I took off thinking I will spend a few months not doing anything. I actually went and watched a movie that week. During the day, I went for a matinee show like I used to in college. And then I realized the world goes on, right? People don't care that I'm watching a movie. So I have to do something about it, right? And it literally took me 48 hours to say, I better do something now, right? And I jumped back on my feet, started ZipDial, started EzeTap around the same time, volunteered my time with the Aadhaar program and sort of used all those lessons, and it sparked the next wave. And I think it's very important, even though I know a lot of entrepreneurs who listen to this show might wonder, how do you deal with adversities? There will be times where it won't work out, right? And that's reality, right? But you just have to accept it at that time and put it behind you, right? It's like very much like a cricket match. Scoring a century in the first innings doesn't mean you're guaranteed anything in the second innings, and vice versa. Getting out for a first ball duck in the first innings, or getting out after having done all the hard work and seen off the new ball, which is what I felt like in MCheck, and it was time, and then suddenly something else happened, and without doing anything, something happened, somebody bowled a Yorker, I didn't see it, bam, out, right? But you start again in the next innings, and you start again at zero in both cases, right? And you have other opportunities, right? And I think we need to be thankful for the opportunities we get, right? And share those moments here, right? So that was, I would say, one of the things I've talked about, and a couple of others in the book as well. And I think people should understand and realize, especially as youngsters, that we haven't seen a lot of crises, right? For most of the average age of people in India, this is the first crisis they're seeing in their professional lives, right? And perhaps in their personal lives, right? It is never the end. It is always a new beginning. And I think that's the takeaway I'd like most people uh, who are either listening to this podcast and hopefully read the book to take away from this.
So I just talk of two stories, Siddharth. One is about a person I know really well, and one is from history, because I really believe, that the stories from history also can be very, very inspiring and motivating. So let me just first talk of this woman scientist, Henrietta Leavitt. So at one point of time, there was a big debate in cosmology and physics. That big debate was whether the Milky Way was the whole of the universe, or was there a universe beyond the Milky Way. This debate was settled by Edward Hubble. He figured out that, the Milky Way was 100,000 light years across, whereas the nearest galaxy, or the patch of light called Andromeda, was more than 900,000 light years away. And this was enough to show that, there is a universe out there much beyond the Milky Way, and the Milky Way is a small part of the universe. The second biggest debate in cosmology was also settled by Edward Hubble. And that debate was whether the universe originated as a Big Bang, or was it always there, the steady state theory. And this was settled by, Hubble making a series of observations where he figured out that all the galaxies are racing away from one another. And the velocity at which they're moving away from each other depends upon, or is directly proportional to, the distance between them. And he was therefore able to settle this debate by saying that a Big Bang created this universe. Now, the interesting thing is that this is not the story of Edward Hubble. The interesting thing is that he was able to solve both these problems because he found a way to measure distances in the universe. And that method was figured out by Henrietta Leavitt, a deaf and dumb woman who actually deserved the Nobel Prize. She didn't get the Nobel Prize, but through painstakingly, through backbreaking work, looking at hundreds of thousands of photographic plates from different observatories, she figured out a way, and I won't talk about that way because it's a bit complex, to figure out what are the distances of different celestial objects in the universe. And because of that, Hubble was able to therefore crack both these problems. And actually, at some point of time, when the Nobel Committee wanted to consider her for the Nobel Prize, and they went looking for her, they found that she had died 4 years before. She was a woman born as a woman at the wrong time in history, when women were not even allowed to, get a graduate degree in any subject. Cambridge offered degrees to women only after 1946. So, what motivates someone like a Henrietta Leavitt? And there are many other scientists, women scientists particularly, who were just born as women and therefore born into adversity, and therefore were denied all the, credit that they duly deserved. The second example I would talk about is about a lady called Pushpalata in Bangalore. I actually like going and meeting interesting people. In fact, that has been one of my passions, having conversations with people from different walks of life. I met her sometime, I think, in 2018, when I was writing this book, Cutting the Gordian Knot, India's Quest for Prosperity, when I heard about her. And I thought, let me go and meet her. So she was a woman who started her life as a sex worker. She actually fell in love with a man who was more than twice her age and eloped with him. He sold her into the flesh trade, and she lived in railway stations and bus stations where destitute people in India normally put up. And gradually she figured out that her purpose in life was to solve the problems that sex workers in Bangalore were facing. And she understood what problems they were facing. She understood the police harassment, why it was happening, what she should do about it. She understood the health issues and what she could do to address these health issues. The conversation was extremely interesting. It gave me deep insights into the underbelly of flesh trade in India and how it actually operates. It's such a big market that an entrepreneur can actually exploit in terms of creating healthcare products for them. And she ended up, creating an organization that serves the needs of 15,000 sex workers in Bangalore. She runs a small bank that provides loans for the needy sex workers in Bangalore who are part of her organization. She ensures that they are well taken care of, they are well represented, their security is addressed. And Bill Gates actually had come to meet her in Bangalore. Yeah, very, very humble, down to earth office. The meeting was on the floor, everybody was squatting. Bill Gates squatted there for 1 hour 45 minutes listening to the presentation by these young intrepid women. So the story for me here is that uh, you need to find some kind of meaning and purpose in life. There was this famous Austrian psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl. He wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. He was a victim of the Auschwitz concentration camp, Nazi concentration camp, and emerged as a survivor. And one of the things he figured out was that those who deal with these kind of life-threatening crises and manage to successfully emerge out of these are those who somewhere believe that the primary purpose of life is a search for meaning. So I think this search for meaning sometimes looks 30,000 feet view, and sometimes seems very philosophical and not something that all of us can attain. But I'm reasonably sure at this point of time, after so many years, that I think it's important to have some kind of a purpose in life, and that purpose need not be extremely great. For example, helping people selflessly can be a purpose, and sometimes it gives you returns eventually, and sometimes it may not give you returns, but if that's what you like doing, then it's fun in itself. So I think the people who come out of a crisis like this, the Pushpalata's crisis, very successfully, I have found are somewhere who believe that it's important to have a purpose in life. So these are the two stories that I wanted to share. There are many more stories like this, Siddharth.
They are very powerful stories, right? Of how these women never let the crisis drown them, and the purpose kept them floating, and finally they're able to steer clear of the crisis as well as set an example for others. That's the best part. Your life becomes meaningful for others to live by. I think
Yeah.
that's a life to live by. Hari, you have shared few leadership traits, on sailing through the storm. Would you like to talk more about them?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about a couple. Maybe Sanjay can talk about a couple. So the first one I'd like to talk about is, the difference between acting and knowing, and that's really the difference between character and intellect. I'd like to talk of three terms here. Intellect, uncluttered thinking, and character. I think intellect isn't being able to understand complex things, whereas uncluttered thinking isn't being able to simplify complex things. Intellect isn't being able to see a lot of interconnections. Uncluttered thinking is about figuring out which interconnections matter and which don't. And character, I think, is above everything else, which is being able to act on that knowledge. So, for example, right, Warren Buffett has told all of us the secret of his investing success. So, we are all knowledgeable on how to make money in the long term by investing correctly. He's told us the secret, but none of us are able to execute on that because we don't demonstrate the character that he has to be able to execute on that. And therefore, investing is not about financial knowledge, it's not about how smart you are or financially savvy you are, it's about character. So, a lot of things in life are really about character. If you know something, do something about it. That demonstrates character. If you see in your organization, some very senior leader demonstrating poor integrity, point it out, bring it out, speak about it, speak to that individual that is not okay. Make integrity as an important value for your organization. I think that is character. Whereas all of us know that integrity is important. Let us personally lead lives of integrity. So I think character is in doing something about what you know. That's, I would say, number one trait. The second one, I think, and that's very important in dealing with a crisis, because a crisis does not really need intellect. I think all of us are reasonably smart. I think character is extremely rare. The second one is, I think, in dealing with a crisis, a balance of masculine and feminine leadership traits. And by masculine and feminine, I'm not necessarily talking of men and women. I'm talking of traits that are typically associated with men and women. So, for example, being collaborative, demonstrating warmth, demonstrating vulnerability, seeking help, asking for help, saying I'm unable to do this, I'm not good at this. Those are pretty much considered as feminine traits, whereas ambition, achievement orientation, goal orientation, going after what you want, they're all typically masculine traits. And a lot of crises in this world have been created by unbridled masculine traits. The alpha males in this world have created a lot of these crises: extreme greed, extreme ambition. If you go to the source of any conflict in this world, whether the crisis that led to World War II, World War One, any financial crisis, it's all about alpha males pursuing masculine goals, in an unbridled way. I think if you can bring in those feminine traits, and all of us, if we embody a combination of these two, then I think, first of all, crises are not going to result as frequently as they do. And when a crisis does erupt, I think we'll all be able to deal with it in a much more mature way. These are two I talk about. Sanjay, you want to talk about anything else?
So I'll talk about it slightly differently from how we've written in the book, but a couple of points that I had made in different circumstances as well, but in the book again. I think one of the things that is related to leadership traits is actually decision making, right? And I think having sort of a blueprint for thinking through how to make decisions, when you are in such a crisis, right? And I think a lot of people struggle a lot with making decisions in life with incomplete data. Right? In almost everything we do in life, actually, we don't have complete data. We don't have the luxury of that because you don't know how something is actually going to play out, right? You're just making a calculated guess in some ways, and in some cases you may have a little more data than others, right? But what you want to do is sort of stack the odds towards yourself. Look at, I think the first thing is, we are going to make it work has got to be like an absolute commitment that you're going to have, right? You're not going to necessarily say, well, if this happens, then maybe I'll do it. If not, I'll think about something else. Right? The moment you give yourself an escape, door, that you'll immediately want to use it, right? So I think that's the first thing I feel, people need to do, right? There is no ambiguity about it. We are going to make this thing work, right? Then I think looking at sort of, probabilistic outcomes here, what is the highest probability of something going to happen? And, you really have to make your judgment at that time, and knowing fully well that you might be wrong, right? And be willing to sort of change course if you start observing that, that the risks that you thought actually happen, right? And I think then looking at, what's the best that can happen, what's the worst that can happen, right? Ultimately, we are taking risks in life. The best that can happen had better be so amazing that it's worth taking the risk, right? And the worst that can happen has got to also be something that you're willing to live with, right? So, you really have to be playing for something where the positive situation is spectacular, and the negative situation is not, the end of the world, right? And I think with the combination of these, right, I think both from a leadership perspective as well as a decision-making perspective, you're well equipped, right? So I think, we often think we're making very large decisions in life, right? But none of these, except if it's a medical situation, are really irreversible, right? So we're making a large number of small decisions, and we should really think of it that way, right? The moment we go out there and make a big deal about something that we're doing, invariably you fall flat on your face after some time, right? And then our ego sort of prevents us from accepting that, right? So I think I always tell people, don't overthink it, right? Don't overanalyze, try it out. In some cases, these are important, irreversible decisions. Of course, you need to take those very seriously. But broadly, most of the other decisions we make, if we don't ascribe too much importance to it, we end up actually making the right decisions.
Thank you, Sanjay. And this has been a phenomenal conversation, Hari and Sanjay. To all the listeners, I would encourage them, if these stories have moved you even a tiny bit, go for the book Sailing Through a Storm, Making a Crisis Work for You by T.N. Hari and Sanjay Swamy. This will give you a new perspective and new tools on how to deal with a crisis and how to grow in it. So again, Sanjay and Hari.
Thanks for that.